Hi guys, welcome to IndyCar on the last day of May 2019. In the introduction blurb to today's show, you may have noticed I've quoted comedian Bill Bailey on, well, his description of the political leaders in England at the moment. I was lucky enough last night to take my wife out to see Bill Bailey at the Hydro Arena at Glasgow. And his show is wonderful. He's one of the funniest comedians in the circuit. Bill Bailey is unusual in that he's a musical comic, which makes his show far more entertaining, I think, in my mind, than almost any other comedian. And Bill Bailey's been coming to Scotland for decades, ever since he appeared in Black Books, and also before that when he appeared at the Edinburgh Fringe. So he's a great friend of Scotland's and no friend of English politicians, it seems. Last night, his descriptions of the various leaders in England had the audience rolling in the aisles because, apart from anything else, Bill is one of those people who doesn't come up and try to make jokes at the expense of the Scots. In fact, he very rarely tries to make fun of anybody, other than, I have to say, probably the people in the front row who he likes to have little conversations with. But he never takes the mickey out of the Scots or the Welsh or anybody else. He's not renowned for doing that. His comedy is much more off the wall, left field, unexpected, and as it was last night. But his descriptions of Mrs. May, I think, was perfect. She's a gangling, robotic, praying mantis, and Boris Johnson was described as the bloated carcass of an albino sealpup, which I thought summed him up wonderfully well. He even had some harsh words to say about Jeremy Corbyn, which, coming from Bill, who really is an old socialist, surprised me, but he was right on the money with Corbyn when he described him as looking like a bewildered woodwork teacher who thought he'd left his front door open. All of which had at least 8,000 of an audience last night rolling about laughing. So it was wonderful to actually to have a bit of a laugh for a change about Brexit. And Bill used Brexit as part of his show last night, and he wove it into the show very cleverly, I thought, by on his travels asking people in other countries what they thought of Brexit. And he was describing a conversation between himself and a friend in Amsterdam. And the friend in Amsterdam had said, "Hey Bill, what's this Brexit all about? Is it about cutting off your nose to make your face angry?" And Bill said, No, it hasn't. They haven't even put as much thought as that into it. So you can see the kind of direction he was taking. Anyway, that aside, I have to say, if you ever get the chance to see Bill Bailey live, I recommend him to you. The place was almost a sellout last night, even despite the terrible weather. However, to get back to the point, as well as wanting to tell you I'd been to see Bill Bailey, I thought that would be a nice way to start today's show, since it's such a miserable day. It needed cheering up a little bit. However, there is a serious side to the show today, and that is that there has been in the press a lot of publicity about whether or not any of the new Tory leaders or leader contenders, if they ever become Tory leader and Prime Minister, are in fact entitled, shall we say, to refuse to give Scotland permission to have a referendum. Now, this is something which boils the blood of just about everybody online, and has caused a lot of annoyance, but also a lot of very good trolling, particularly the whole of Scotland yesterday trolling Sajid Javid with a tagline which said, "Have you asked Javid?" Basically, this whole thing about Ask Javid meant that whatever you did in Scotland, you had to ask Sajid Javid's permission first. So a lot of good humour going around. But despite that, there is a serious issue here, which I think needs to be clarified for us Scots as well as for the English. And one of the things that is not being said, but if you read the column by Paul Kavanagh, who writes under the name Wee Ginger Dog, you'll know the story of this. And it's the story of the legislation which the SNP government has laid before Holyrood to create the foundations for any kind of referendums in the future which are within the capability of Holyrood to conduct. Now you might think, okay, that sounds quite wishy-washy, that sounds actually quite lame, and in a way it is, but if you think about it, basically what they've done is they've created a bill which is very general and which gives or will give the Holyrood Parliament, not just the Scottish Government, but the Holyrood Parliament, the right to organise and hold referendums in the future which involve all of the electorate of Scotland over the age of 16 who are EU citizens. They don't have to be British citizens, they just have to be EU citizens. And anyone who has come from outside of the EU who is now living in Scotland, who is domiciled here, has an address here. So it's a very wide remit. That's the first thing. It gives a very broad definition of who can vote, which is all wonderful. It means that everybody can vote who is an adult. Over the age of 16, you're an adult. That's good news for everyone, because everyone then has the right to a vote. That's not contentious in any way. When you think about it, that would hold for any referendum anywhere. Doesn't matter what the subject is. But one of the things that people have not really noticed is that this referendum bill doesn't say independence anywhere in it. It doesn't say that they're going to legislate to hold an independence referendum, or a referendum on the future of the Union, or a referendum about leaving the EU, or anything else. It just says referendums, generally. And it's very difficult for the English government or the English-based parties to launch any kind of legal attack on that, because they have not, in any part of this legislation, specified that they're going to be having a referendum on anything outside of those devolved issues. Now that means that we could have a referendum on whether we have all those European powers back, for example. And that would be within our competence, because those powers, the ones which have been stolen, remember, by Westminster, 111 of them, naturally belong to Scotland because they're devolved. They're not part of the so-called reserved powers that Westminster holds. And so because of that, this bill would allow us, if we wanted to have a referendum to say we want those powers back. And the whole of Scotland, if they voted in majority to have those powers back, it would be impossible, legally impossible, for the British government to withhold them, because the Scottish government is acting within its entitlement. It's acting within its powers over, over laws which it naturally has the jurisdiction over. Not only that, but this particular bill is written in Scottish law, Scots law. Scots law is enshrined in the Act of Union in perpetuity. That means that Scots law can never be usurped or overridden by English law. Now this is an interesting and a very important distinction, because no matter what legislation is brought forward in Holyrood, if it is done A, under Scots law and within the devolved powers of the Parliament, within the scope of its powers, then it cannot ever be challenged in an English Supreme Court. And that means that this legislation, which creates the foundations for a referendum, possibly on the future direction that Scotland goes, on its constitutional future perhaps, its membership of the EU perhaps, they can't attack it in an English Supreme Court, because it doesn't specify anything outside of the Scottish Government's competence. So that means it's impossible for Ruth Davidson, Willie Rennie or anybody else to say this is not competent. We cannot have, Ken Macintosh can no longer say, I don't believe this is within the competence of Holyrood, and try and get it overridden in the so-called English Supreme Court. Now, remember the bill that was launched by the SNP called the Continuity Bill. The Continuity Bill was a piece of Scottish legislation under Scottish law which made sure that those 111 powers that I was talking about a few minutes ago returned to Scotland because they were devolved. And that was passed by the Scottish High Court. End of story, you might think. No. The British government decided to challenge that legislation in their Supreme Court. Now remember, Scottish law cannot be usurped by English law, or it breaks the Acts of the Union. The English court then decided that the Scottish the Scottish bill was lawful, except for one little tiny bit of it. And they had to kind of specify what the little tiny bit of it was, but they couldn't rule against it, because if the English Supreme Court had ruled against that completely, it would have broken the Act of Union completely, And the Scottish government could then have taken the British government to court, and to one of the highest courts on the planet, you know, at the United Nations, wherever. But it could have looked at the international court and taken the British government to court and said, you have broken the Treaty of Union with Scotland. We are therefore entitled under the terms of the Treaty of Union to end the Union because you broke it. And this is something which has never been tested in court. So when people tell you that Scotland holding a referendum on independence is illegal without Sajid Javid or some other idiot down in London telling you that you've got permission, remember that that's never been tested. Never been tested in the High Court. The Scottish courts, we can rule that we can have referendums, right? We can rule that anytime we like. Right now we can rule that. And the English government cannot touch it. And they dare not challenge it. Because if they do challenge it, and if they ever did, let's say we got to the wire and we said we're having a referendum, you have not given a Section 30 order, you've refused all the way along, and we have no choice now but to hold a referendum without it. If the English government said, well, we'll take you to court over it, then the Scottish government would say, right, we will see you in the International Court of Justice, because your law cannot usurp ours, and you've denied us the opportunity to exercise another right that we have under a thing called the claim of right, which is a piece of British legislation which guarantees that the people of Scotland have the sovereign right to decide their own future. So they would be breaking the Bill of Rights as well as breaking the Act of Union, and it would be challenged by the Scottish government in the International Court of Justice. These are things which we are not really supposed to know about. These are things which the big boys and the big politicians know about, all the political minds and the legal egos in the various parties. And it's the reason why the SNP, I believe, is so relaxed about having a referendum. Because, I don't know about you, but I don't think we'll even need to have a referendum. By the time it gets to Halloween this year, if we're still on course for a no-deal Brexit, the no-deal Brexit also breaks the terms of the claim of right, because all of Scotland, a majority of Scots, voted to stay in the European Union, and that cannot be usurped by an English action. English voters usurping the sovereignty of the Scots over their own self-determination breaks that piece of legislation. It's Westminster legislation, incidentally, not Scottish, called the claim of right. The claim of right establishes the rights of the Scots to vote on their own future. So we are guaranteed every which way that no matter what the British government does now, it is in a catch-22. It cannot legally withhold the Section 30 order at the point where we're about to leave the European Union. If it does that in the face of opposition of 62% of the Scots, who are sovereign in this case, then we would be perfectly within our rights for our government to end the Union there and then and see the British government in court later over it. But there is no way that Sajid Javid or anybody else can gainsay the rights of about 5.5 million Scots, because we have both the well, if you go back to you could go all the way back to the Arbroath Declaration, which says we're sovereign, but the actual Bill of Rights is the updated version of that guarantees it in Westminster, not Scotland, in Westminster, under the laws of the UK. The Scots are guaranteed the right to vote on their own self-determination. Any Prime Minister who goes against that is breaking the terms of that UK legislation, and they're breaking the terms of the Acts and the Treaties of Union, and the Union would be over at that moment. It's a situation which has been gradually building. The SNP have been very clever. All of the politicians who have been strategising and gaming this out have realised that the end point will always come to the point just before we leave the European Union. And at that moment, the British government has to make a choice. Are they going to risk seeing us in court, or are they going to give us the Section 30 order and allow it to happen in a legal, smooth fashion? That's why our leader thinks that the Section 30 order will eventually have to come from whoever becomes the Prime Minister. Doesn't matter whether it is the bloated corpse of an albino sealpup. It will be not their place to tell us what we can and cannot have and what we can and cannot vote about. I think the union's usefulness or its utility in terms of everybody on these islands is over now, and we are now just counting down the moments to the launch of the new Scottish state, because it's the British people who have decided this, not us. It's the English voters who have decided on the breakup of the British Union, not us. It is English voters who decided to leave Europe. It's English voters who decided to break the Acts of Union and to break the claim of right. And because they've done so under the guidance of the Tory government, then effectively the whole union fails. It's over. The terms are broken and lying in pieces on the floor, and there is no reason even for us to need a referendum if we dragged out of the European Union. And remember, those words, situation like or such as being taken out of the European Union against the will of the people of Scotland, that's a very specific set of circumstances which is specifically cited by the Scottish Government, that if that happened there would be a vote on independence. And not only would it be a vote on independence, it would be legally framed as well, because they're looking at section 62 of the United Nations Charter, I believe, if I remember the terms correctly, and that guarantees that parties in a union or parties in a treaty with one another, if there is a material change, and it's a specified material change that one party specifies, if that happens we will end the treaty, then they're entitled to end the treaty. They've given fair warning to the other party. If they do this, the union is over, and that's exactly what is happening here. We warned the British government that if they took us out of Europe against our people's own will, then this would be the result. All of these factors are converging on Halloween now. It all focuses down to that one point in time. And whatever unlucky sod the Tories have picked to be in charge of the British state at that moment will have to decide to let us go. That's where I'm going to leave the show for today. Have a great weekend, everybody, despite the rain, and I'll see you all on Sunday. Bye bye.